The alarm never sounded. Marcus Vance perceived this absence as if it had its own weight, 2 minutes and 40 seconds after Vanguard Station plunged into the belly of the Alcubierre portal. During the 18 months of preparation for this mission, he had timed the second pressure verification cycle exactly 836 times in simulation at the Unified Space Alliance training facilities in Greenwich. The cycle always took 2 minutes and 42 seconds. A faint tonal whistle in the 400 Hz spectrum would be heard, followed by vocal confirmation from the central system. Marcus Vance had come to dream of that sound. The silence that came in its place was not the silence of vacuum, which he had learned to recognize and even, perversely, respect over 11 years of space service. It was something different. It was dense, like a pause between two beats of a heart that simply refused to continue. The geometry surrounding Vanguard Station defied any vocabulary he knew. The Alcubierre portal, named by international media in honor of the theorist whose mathematics had made this moment possible, distorted the space around them in translucent layers that overlapped and folded upon themselves like the pages of a book being crumpled by invisible hands. Through the armored viewports of the scientific observation deck, the universe looked like an impressionistic painting by someone who had just discovered that physics was merely an elegant suggestion. Marcus Vance had seen photographs of the 2 previous unmanned missions. The images did not prepare anyone for the reality. He was at his monitoring station in Sector C2 of the scientific deck, tracking gravitational resonance sensors in real time, when the first impossible data point appeared on the screen. The external hull temperature reading in the dorsal sector, obtained by the TH7 sensor, at 14:32:07, arrived on his monitor with all parameters correct. But then, 4 milliseconds later, the ship's central system processed and cataloged that same data as if it were being received for the first time. As if the universe had read the same sentence twice, skipping a line in between. Marcus Vance blinked. He looked again. The data continued to arrive on his monitor before being officially logged by the central system. A desynchronization so subtle that any standard quality control filter would discard it as transmission noise. Marcus Vance did not discard it. In 12 years of experimental physics, he had learned that the universe always whispered before it screamed. It was then that he felt the pulse. It wasn't a sound exactly, or at least not one the ship's microphones would pick up. It was a vibration coming from below, from Vanguard Station's own structure, passing through the soles of Marcus Vance's magnetic boots and rising up his spine like a bass note on an instrument no one had yet invented. Thump. A pause of exactly 1.2 seconds. Thump. The regularity was geometric, relentless, and completely alien to any propulsion or ventilation system Marcus Vance knew. He opened a new log file on the secondary terminal, keeping the main monitoring window in the foreground to avoid drawing attention. His fingers moved over the haptic keyboard with the firmness of someone who had spent their entire life turning fear into collectible data. Delta Pulse, he typed, choosing the name intuitively, as if the designation already existed somewhere in his memory even before it was needed. Frequency, 0. 8. Hertz pattern, regular. Amplitude, infrasonic, structure-borne. Origin, undetermined. Initial log, 14:32:11. Hypotheses, warp field interference with the ship's structural resonance, propulsive feedback phenomenon, or... He hesitated. His fingers hovered over the keys for exactly 2 seconds before completing the sentence. External phenomenon to the ship of an uncatalogued nature. Across the scientific deck, Commander Sarah Chen performed her routine checks with the calm that had become her trademark in 23 years of space command. The woman had navigated asteroid fields, negotiated operating conditions with 3 different alien representations from the Galactic Council, and once kept a research station operational for 11 days, with half of its redundant systems failing. She moved between control panels like someone born for that environment, reading displays and confirming parameters with an efficiency Marcus Vance had always admired in silence. Beside her, navigation specialist Dr. Yuri Novak murmured trajectory confirmations to the automated piloting system, his voice level and professional as always. Neither of them seemed to notice the pulse. Neither of them seemed to notice anything outside the expected parameters. "Chen," Marcus Vance said, maintaining a tone of someone merely confirming a routine. "Are you picking up any oscillations in the structural sensors? Could be field interference in Sector C?" The commander consulted the panel to her left without interrupting the verification cycle. "Negative, Vance. All structural sensors within operational limits. Do you have any specific readings you'd like me to analyze?" Marcus Vance looked at the screen where the 4-millisecond desynchronization continued to repeat with the persistence of a metronome. "No. Must be background noise. My analysis filter is probably hypersensitive." He closed the internal voice channel and returned to the private log. 15 astronomical units from the portal, aboard the Galactic Council observation platform. Delegate Keth Al monitored the event with his 6 synchronized optical sensors in high-precision mode. The crystalline being had observed over 4 centuries of diplomatic service, 37 attempts by distinct species to traverse a spatial warp portal. None of them had generated the laminar quantum interference pattern his instruments were detecting now. The pattern was subtle enough to be impossible to capture with standard human technology, but for Kethal's sensors, it was as clear as a flame in vacuum. The human ship wasn't simply traveling through the portal. It was beginning to exist in more than one state simultaneously. Kethal transmitted a coded alert to the other 3 delegates on the platform and then returned to observation. In 4 centuries of service, the delegate had learned that there were moments when the only sensible thing to do was to witness. Vanguard Station's crew manifest changed at 1434:03. Marcus Vance only saw it because he had left the personnel management system window open in the background while cross-referencing resonance data. For less than 1/10 of a second, too short for any automatic log to capture with standard resolution, the line corresponding to his own name displayed a specialization he had never possessed: Quantum Systems Architecture, Level 9, Galactic Certification. And then it reverted to normal, Experimental Physics, Level 7, as if the universe had corrected a typo. Marcus Vance had no galactic certification in anything, nor did he know, until that moment, that such a designation existed. "Approaching midpoint," Dr. Novak announced. 4 minutes and 30 seconds of transit completed. 2 minutes and 30 seconds remaining. The geometry outside the viewports shifted. The translucent layers of warped space stopped advancing in one direction and began to contract, as if the tunnel itself were breathing. Marcus Vance felt a pressure not in his ears, but in his cognition, as if his brain was trying to process 2 equally valid answers to the same question simultaneously. "Preparing for portal exit in 2 minutes, Commander Chen said. "All systems nominal. Vance, confirm field sensors." Marcus Vance opened his mouth to confirm. At that exact instant, he saw in the darkened reflection in the side viewport a figure standing in the corridor to his left. Its back to him. Posture, height, the specific way the weight was distributed over the shoulders. It was unmistakable. It was himself, looking down the corridor as if waiting for something that was about to arrive from the other side. When Marcus Vance turned, the corridor was completely empty. "Field sensors confirmed," he said in a voice he barely recognized as his own. "Everything nominal." The delta pulse beat once more, deeper than before, and Marcus Vance had the absolute certainty that the universe had just made a mistake it didn't know how to undo. The portal exit was violent in its silence. There was no explosion, no tremor, no dramatic boom that films of the previous century always promised when imagining warp travel. There was just an instant of non-existence, and Marcus Vance would be convinced of this for the rest of his life, in which Vanguard Station was nowhere, and then it was in open space, in orbit of a star they called Sigma Draconis 18. 8 light-years from the Sun, 7 minutes and 2 seconds after entering the Alcubierre Portal, the most ambitious mission in human history had technically been successfully completed. Marcus Vance stood before the main viewport of the scientific deck, and the first thing he did was look for the asteroid belt. It wasn't there. The Sigma Draconis 4 asteroid belt was one of the most reliable navigation markers of the destination system, an irregular ring of rocky debris that unmanned probes had mapped in millimeter detail during the 3 years of preparation for the mission. The orbital data was etched into the ship's computers, onto every crew member's tablet, and into Marcus Vance's memory with the precision of something reviewed hundreds of times. He knew exactly where that belt should be. It wasn't. "Novak," Commander Chen said, and for the first time since Marcus Vance had known her, the commander's voice carried an audible thread of tension. "Confirm position coordinates." "Coordinates confirmed, Commander. We are in the correct orbital position relative to Sigma Draconis." A pause. "But the secondary reference markers do not match the mission map." Define "do not match." The SD4 asteroid belt is not present in any of the 5 detection spectra, nor is the minor moon SD4b. Dr. Novak looked up from his console for the first time. It's as if they never existed. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. For Marcus Vance, they were 4 productive seconds. He was already at the terminal, cross-referencing the portal exit data with the gravitational field readings around the ship. The numbers told a story he didn't yet know how to verbalize completely, but whose first words were already enough to make his heart race, not from fear, but from the specific excitement of someone on the verge of a discovery that would change everything previously known. The external communication channel opened with a protocol signal Marcus Vance recognized from mandatory diplomatic training. 3 descending tones followed by a prolonged one at a neutral frequency. It was the formal greeting of the Galactic Council, used in first contact with species considered in a state of vulnerability or detected anomaly. The ship's universal translator processed the message in less than a second. "This is Delegate Kethal, representing the Council of United Species. We have identified the human vessel Vanguard Station in a state of laminar quantum anomaly of degree 6. We request immediate immobilization of the ship and emergency evacuation to a neutral platform. Confirm receipt." Commander Chen looked at Marcus Vance. Marcus Vance looked at the data on the screen. Commander Chen looked at the data and then back at Marcus Vance. "What is a laminar quantum anomaly of degree 6? She asked. "I have no idea," Marcus Vance admitted, "but I have an initial hypothesis you won't like hearing." Kethal, on the observation platform, awaited the human response with an attention his fellow delegates did not fail to notice. Delegate Voss Arendal, a gaseous species originating from a binary system on the periphery of Messier 31, floated towards him and pulsed a query in thermal frequency. Why the delay? Lesser species invariably responded immediately to Council emergency protocols. It was basic survival conditioning. Kethal did not respond immediately. He was observing the human ship's emission data. Instead of immobilizing its propulsive systems in response to the emergency protocol, Vanguard Station was increasing the energy consumption of its analysis computers. Someone aboard was collecting data. In the midst of a quantum anomaly of degree 6, someone aboard had decided it was the appropriate time to conduct research. In 4 centuries of galactic diplomacy, Kethal had not seen this before. Marcus Vance had reached chief engineering when the numbers began to make enough sense to become disturbing. He needed the raw propulsion logs, the unfiltered data that the central system processed but rarely displayed to the end user, and the only crew member with direct access to them was Chief Engineer Lena Torres. Torres received him at the engine room door with an expression Marcus Vance didn't immediately recognize. It wasn't that Torres looked different on the surface, the same angular face, the same direct posture he associated with the woman he had trained with for 18 months in Greenwich. But her eyes were different, not in color or shape, in frequency, like someone tuned to a slightly different channel of reality than the others occupied. And when she spoke, her timbre was a semitone lower than Marcus Vance had memorized without realizing he had memorized it. "Vance." She gestured for him to enter. "I was expecting you. I've already downloaded the propulsion logs." Marcus Vance stopped at the threshold. "I haven't said I needed the propulsion logs yet." Torres looked at him with an expression that wasn't strangeness, but something closer to patient recognition. "You didn't need to. You always come for the raw logs when there's a field anomaly, on every jump we've made together." Marcus Vance stood still for a moment. They had made exactly 2 simulated jumps together during training in Greenwich. Never more than that. "Torres," he said calmly in the way he used when he needed to measure a variable without disturbing it, "how many field jumps do you have logged on your service record?" She looked back at him with eyes that were hers and not hers at the same time. 16, she replied without hesitation. 2 of this portal class. Why? Marcus Vance took the tablet with the propulsion logs and returned to the scientific deck, maintaining a regular pace as the delta pulse continued beneath his feet, constant as ever, and in his head a theory began to take shape that was as elegant as it was utterly devastating in its implications. He was in the access corridor when he saw the first duplicate with enough clarity that he couldn't ignore it. It was Dr. Novak. Or at least it was a version of Dr. Novak, his back to Marcus Vance, standing at the intersection between corridors C and D. The posture was identical. The service uniform was the same, but this Dr. Novak was staring at the wall as if there was something visible only to him, in a different spectrum of shared reality. When Marcus Vance opened his mouth to call out, the figure slowly turned its head, and for a fraction of a second Marcus Vance saw with absolute clarity that this version's eyes were not focused on this corridor. They were focused somewhere else, at some other time, performing some action that belonged to a version of the mission this universe had chosen not to follow. And then it vanished. It didn't teleport. It didn't turn a corner. It simply ceased to be present. Marcus Vance resumed walking. In his hand, the propulsion logs awaited analysis. In his head, the theory gained more precise words with each step. On the soles of his boots, the delta pulse marked its unwavering rhythm. And somewhere in the ship's communication system, Delegate Keth Ale was asking for the 3rd time for Vanguard Station to confirm the emergency evacuation protocol. Marcus Vance had no intention of evacuating. There was work to do, and he had learned, in 12 years of experimental physics, that the universe never returned the time spent fleeing a problem that could be measured. Kethal registered with clinical interest that Vanguard Station had, finally, sent a response to the emergency channel. It was not an evacuation confirmation. It was a formal database request. All previous cases of laminar quantum anomaly recorded by the Council, classified by resolution method and species outcome. Vos Erindal pulsed something that any present translator would have classified as incredulity. Kethal processed the request for 7 seconds before beginning to compile the data. There were 43 cases. None had been actively resolved. But there was a first time for everything, and humans, Kethal had begun to suspect, had a relationship with first times that no other council species had demonstrated with the same intensity. The delegates sent the data and waited, with the total attention of a being who had lived 400 years and still had never seen anything like it. The theory, like all good theories, began with an imperfect metaphor. Imagine you're filming 2 versions of the same movie at the same time, in the same studio, with the same actors, Marcus Vance said, leaning on the edge of the analysis table in the scientific deck, while Commander Chen and Dr. Novak listened with expressions that bordered on skepticism and alarm. Each production has its own director, its own script, its own decisions. Most of the time, the two movies are almost identical. But at certain key moments, Director A turns left and Director B turns right, and from there, the stories diverge. "And we're the studio," Commander Chen said. "We are the studio. Vanguard Station crossed the portal at a point where two layers of quantum probability were close enough for the warp field to intersect them. We didn't just travel from one point to another in space. We crossed the boundary between two causal trajectories that existed in superposition. Now we are in both simultaneously." Dr. Novak stared at Marcus Vance for a long moment. "You're saying we're in two realities at the same time." "I'm saying the ship is in a state analogous to quantum superposition. Technically, the collapse hasn't occurred yet. We are Schrödinger's cat, but with antimatter propulsion and a navigation problem that needs solving." Marcus Vance picked up the cup of coffee he had prepared before the meeting and took a long sip. It was the third of the shift. He had developed the habit in academia, when night shifts of dissertation work demanded fuel the body didn't approve of but tolerated, and he had continued it over 12 years of missions because the universe, in his experience, rarely waited for anyone to rest. "The propulsion data Torres gave me confirms that the ship's engines recorded two slightly different trajectories during transit. One ended here, the other—" He shook his head. "I don't know where the other ended." The communication channel opened again. The Galactic Council's 3 descending tone protocol, this time followed by an additional tone the Universal Translator automatically labeled as critical urgency level. "Vanguard Station, this is Delegate Keth All. We detect an increase in the density of lamellar manifestations aboard your vessel. The situation is escalating to a degree 7 anomaly. I inform you that no recorded species has survived a degree 8 laminar anomaly in an active state. I reiterate, request immediate evacuation to a neutral platform." Commander Chen looked at Marcus Vance. Marcus Vance looked at the data and then activated the outbound channel. "Kethal, I need a technical definition of a lamellar manifestation, and also the 43 cases you sent me classified by temporal progression pattern, not by final outcome." There was a pause on the alien side that the Universal Translator couldn't classify into any of the standard emotional categories in its database. After 5 seconds, Kethal responded. "Are you requesting reclassification of research data in the middle of a potential extinction emergency?" "I'm asking for data that will allow me to solve the problem instead of running from it," Marcus Vance said, with the same tone he used when explaining thermodynamics to first-year students who didn't yet understand why they should care. "Are you going to send me this data, or will I have to deduce everything from scratch? Because either option works. The first is just more efficient for both sides." The pause this time lasted 8 seconds. Then the data began to arrive in a continuous stream. Outside on the observation platform, Delegate Voss Arundel pulsed something towards Kethal that any present translator would have rendered as, "Are you sending classified research documentation to a vessel in an extinction crisis?" Kethal observed Vanguard Station's emission data, where the analysis computer's consumption had risen by another 30% since the beginning of the communication. Apparently, the delegate replied, "It's what the humans need to function." The first duplicate visible to all crew members simultaneously occurred at 16:47, 2 hours after exiting the portal. Marcus Vance was in the access corridor between the scientific deck and engineering when it appeared, and this time there was no way for each to process the event individually. A version of Commander Chen walked directly through the solid wall of Sector B4, 3 steps, crossed the corridor as if the metal and insulating polymer didn't exist, and vanished into the opposite bulkhead like an image projected onto a space that had no screen. The version of Commander Chen, who was next to Marcus Vance, stopped in the same fraction of a second, looking at the space where the duplicate had passed, and for the first time in the entire mission, the commander was completely devoid of visible expression. Was that what I think it was? She asked. Yes, Marcus Vance replied, already typing on his tablet. The duplicates multiplied in the following hours with a progression that Keth All's data described with disturbing accuracy. Most were transient, a fragment of a second of a gesture or posture that belonged to another version of the crew superimposed onto the present reality, like a double exposure photograph developed on the same plate. But some were more substantial. There was a version of Dr. Novak that periodically appeared at the navigation station, executing trajectory adjustments in coordinates the ship's computers did not recognize. There was a version of Torres that always walked in the opposite direction of the corridor the real Torres had just traversed, like an echo that lagged by exactly the wrong amount of time. Marcus Vance created a log table on his tablet and began to catalog each appearance: time, location, duration, observed behavior. The crew, initially shaken, began to copy the method without anyone explicitly suggesting they should. This was what humans did. Marcus Vance had observed over 11 years of service in extreme conditions, not just out of training, but from something deeper and prior to training. When the world became incomprehensible, they measured. When they measured, they regained a sense of agency. And when they had a sense of agency, they could continue functioning where other species simply stopped. Keth All sent a coded communication to the other delegates. The humans are cataloging the manifestations. Voss Arundel responded, "Is this a known survival behavior?" "I do not know what it is," Keth All admitted, which, for a 400-year-old being who had cataloged the behavior of 3,000 species, was a statement of considerable weight. The Council database recorded 43 cases of laminar anomaly over 10,000 years of documented galactic history. In none of them had the affected species maintained collective functional coherence beyond 12 hours after the onset of manifestations. The cognitive disintegration caused by the superposition of memories and identities was, according to all available records, inevitable. The affected species simply ceased to be able to distinguish which version of themselves was the original version and collapsed into total paralysis. Marcus Vance read this carefully. He took another sip of coffee, the fourth of the shift. He continued the log table. Dr. Novak, who had read the same passage over Marcus Vance's shoulder, stared at the cup. "Is that coffee? The fourth cup this shift?" "Concentrate," Marcus Vance confirmed. "I have emergency reserves." "That's not what worries me." Dr. Novak paused. Keth All mentioned in a footnote that caffeine's primary metabolite is a Category 2 neurotoxin for 6 of the Council member species. It kills by synaptic accumulation. Marcus Vance considered this for a moment. "Is that why they never serve coffee at diplomatic meetings?" "Presumably." "Good to know," Marcus Vance said and finished his cup. The delta pulse had doubled in intensity by 17:30. By 1815, Marcus Vance found he could predict the next 3 beats with millimeter precision. The pulse's regularity wasn't random, it was a pattern, and patterns had structure, and structure had meaning. He initiated a full spectral analysis using the scientific DEX precision microphones recalibrated for the infrasonic spectrum, converting the structural vibration into frequency data that could be mapped as signal instead of noise. It was in the middle of this process that the entity first appeared in a way that couldn't be mistaken for a crew manifestation. At the end of the main corridor, where emergency lighting created shadow zones between access panels, there was a form. It wasn't a duplicate of anyone. It was something more fundamental, a presence that seemed to reorganize space around itself as mass reorganizes gravity without defined color, without a precise enough contour to be described in conventional geometric language, but undeniably present in the sensor log and in Marcus Vance's sensory perception simultaneously, and there was a directionality to it, an orientation that didn't need eyes to exist. It was looking at Marcus Vance. The log table on the tablet received a new entry, 1823, main corridor, unidentified entity, not categorized as crew duplicate. Observation duration, 12 seconds. Behavior, static, oriented towards me. Emits delta pulse in direct field, not structure-mediated. Personal note. I'm not sure who is studying whom at this point. Keth Al, who had monitored the ship's external sensors in real time throughout the journey, detected the entity's field signature and processed the data with a speed that, for a crystalline being, was the equivalent of being breathless. The correction entity had manifested internally within the ship. In the 43 previous cases, this was the stage immediately preceding the final collapse of the affected species. The resolution, in all recorded cases, had been either chaotic fusion or the elimination of the divergent variant. Kethal opened the communication channel once more with an urgency that 400 years of diplomacy contained but did not completely conceal. Vanguard Station, the correction entity is active aboard. All recorded cases indicate you have less than 6 hours before irreversible collapse. I implore you to reconsider evacuation. Marcus Vance's response arrived 40 seconds later, a time during which Keth Al had imagined at least 12 possible outcomes for the situation. The response read, "Understood. Thank you for the data. Continuing analysis." Kethal stared at the message for a long moment. Then, for the first time in 4 centuries of service, the delegate did not know what to record on the incident report form as the observed species behavior classification. The first conversation Marcus Vance had with himself occurred in the medical bay at 2117, with Vanguard Station suspended silently in a holding orbit around Sigma Draconis, and the manifestations aboard reaching a frequency of 63 catalogued occurrences per hour. He had gone to the medical bay to get more liquid caffeine concentrate from the emergency reserves when he saw his own reflection in the mirrored surface of the sterilization chamber stopped moving. Marcus Vance stopped. The reflection stayed where it was. Then the reflection opened its mouth and said, "You know this can't continue." The voice was his with clinical precision, at the frequency and timbre he heard when listening to his own recordings, which is slightly different from the voice one hears when speaking because the skull filters certain frequencies in a way that open air does not. The reflection, which Marcus Vance mentally decided to call the first observer, because naming things was a way to control them and to make it clear even to himself that he was dealing with a phenomenon and not a hallucination, was not wearing the same service uniform. It was wearing an evacuation suit, the standard type worn when a mission was officially aborted due to safety protocol. "At what point did you abort?" Marcus Vance asked, because it was the most productive question available in that context. 4 minutes and 11 seconds after portal entry, the first observer replied. "Field instability in the propulsion sector. Clear sensor reading." Commander Chen made the right decision immediately. "We returned through the portal before structural collapse. The mission was logged as aborted for technical reasons. The crew is fine. We made it home." "You made it home," Marcus Vance corrected. "I came out the other side." The first observer tilted its head, and Marcus Vance recognized the gesture because it was what he did when processing something he disliked but needed to accept. "The problem," the other version said, "is that there's only room for one stable causal continuity. The portal created a divergence that the universe cannot sustain indefinitely without increasing cost. The longer you remain in an active state, the more unstable the superposition becomes. In the end, one of the versions inevitably collapses. And you're here to tell me which version collapses. I'm here to tell you that the stable version is me. That the version that made it home, that has a clean record and an intact crew and a universe that knows how to process it, is me. And that you." The first observer did not say with cruelty, Marcus Vance noted, but with something closer to genuine sorrow, "are an echo that the universe hasn't yet managed to resolve." Marcus Vance picked up the bottle of caffeine concentrate from the shelf and broke the seal with the same methodical gesture as always, the same gesture he had made in laboratories on 3 continents and in 4 different space stations over 12 years. "You know what's interesting," he said, "is that you're here. If I were just an echo without sufficient quantum substance, you wouldn't need to appear to convince me of anything. The universe would simply eliminate me via the path of least energy cost, which is what the Council's data describes in all 43 previous cases." The first observer remained silent. "The fact that you came here," Marcus Vance continued, drinking the concentrate slowly, "suggests that the situation isn't as simple as you're describing. It suggests that the universe can't simply erase an echo that has sufficient quantum coherence to generate its own consistent causal history. That the divergence created something with enough inherent stability to require." He searched for the exact word. "Active mediation instead of passive collapse. You're trying to negotiate with the fundamental physics of the universe." "I'm human." Marcus Vance took another sip. "We negotiate with everything. It's what we do in the absence of any better tool." Kethal, who had initiated an internal ship monitoring protocol after detecting a bilateral communication pattern in the medical sector, registered the dialogue with a combination of data that his analysis system couldn't fit into any existing category. The human entity was engaged in an information exchange process with its own alternative quantum manifestation. According to all available literature on lamellar anomalies, this was the clear and irreversible sign of final cognitive collapse, the point where the line between versions completely blurred and the affected being lost the ability to distinguish its own causal origin. But Kethal's emotional analysis, which operated in parallel to the logical system as it did with all sentient beings in varying proportions, registered something different. The human was not collapsing. It was constructing an argument. The first observer spoke after a silence long enough for Marcus Vance to finish half the bottle. "You don't understand what the correction entity will do if the divergence isn't resolved in the expected way." "Then explain it to me," Marcus Vance said, "because information is exactly what I need right now." "There's a mechanism," the first observer said. And for the first time, Marcus Vance noticed that the other version of himself seemed genuinely uncomfortable with what it was about to say. "That the universe uses to stabilize large-scale quantum anomalies. It's not conscious, it's not intentional, it's simply physics operating at the most fundamental level. But from the perspective of any entity within the anomaly, it appears active and directed. The entity you saw in the corridor isn't just observing. It's calculating which version of the mission has the lowest energy cost for the universe to sustain. And when the calculation is complete, which of the 2 versions the universe chooses to eliminate," Marcus Vance completed. "Yes." Marcus Vance stared at his own reflection that wasn't his reflection for a long moment. The delta pulse pulsed through the ship's structure, constant, patient, absolutely indifferent to whatever he decided. Then he said, "Or the fusion doesn't produce either of the original 2 versions. It produces a third, a state that incorporates causal information from both trajectories and resolves them into a single, consistent flow." The first observer did not respond immediately. Marcus Vance noticed that the reflection in the sterilization chamber had shifted slightly in angle, as if the reflected figure was beginning to exist on a slightly different plane than the mirror could sustain alone. "That has never been attempted," the other version finally said. "I know," Marcus Vance replied. "But 43 cases have also never been actively resolved, and someone has to be the first. The question isn't whether it's risky. The question is whether the alternative is better." It was then that the correction entity appeared again, this time at the medical bay access, and this time with enough substance that Marcus Vance could feel the delta pulse radiating directly from it as a field and not as structure-mediated vibration. It was like being near a high-powered generator, that presence the skin recognizes before the mind names it. The form was amorphous, without a fixed geometric contour, but there was a directionality to it, with the precision of water finding the path of least resistance. It was moving towards Marcus Vance. And Marcus Vance, contrary to all the emergency protocols he had memorized over 11 years of service, contrary to the instinct of retreat that was older than any training, did not retreat. He stood his ground, with the bottle of caffeine concentrate in his left hand and the tablet in his right, and began to try and measure the field the entity was generating. Outside, on the observation platform, the 4 Galactic Council delegates observed in complete silence. Kethal had stopped transmitting emergency alerts to Vanguard Station 20 minutes earlier, not because the emergency had diminished, but because he had realized that none of the Council's protocols were adequate for what was occurring aboard that ship. A human stood before a quantum correction entity with an analysis tablet in hand, measuring the entity's field with the methodical calm of someone performing a routine laboratory reading. In 10,000 years of documented galactic history, no species had done this before. None had even attempted it. Kethal recorded everything, with the highest resolution the platform's instruments allowed, and felt something that 400 years of diplomatic experience classified, after a moment of processing, as reverence. Science, Marcus Vance had learned back in undergraduate school from a professor who smelled of old coffee and had a whiteboard never quite erased, was essentially the art of asking the right questions with equipment that didn't yet exist to ask them. The tablet had no quantum field sensors, but it had an accelerometer calibrated for 6 axes of motion, a temperature sensor with hundredths of a degree resolution, a precision microphone adjustable for the 1 to 40, 00 Hertz spectrum, and a short-range communication antenna that could be reconfigured by software to transmit in alternative spectra to the standard operating pattern. Marcus Vance worked standing, his back against the medical bay wall, with the correction entity standing approximately 4 meters in front of him and the delta pulse growing in intensity at every 30-second interval. "What are you doing?" The first observer's voice, still present in the sterilization chamber's reflection but progressively fainter, like a radio station losing range as distance increases. "Calibrating," Marcus Vance replied without looking up. What he had discovered, during the hours of spectral analysis before that moment, was that the delta pulse wasn't a vibration without internal structure. It was a sequence with micrometric variations in the duration of pauses between beats, 1.200 seconds, 1.198, 1.203, 1.197. The pattern of variations, when mapped into a binary sequence and represented as pulse width modulation, produced a code Marcus Vance recognized with the specificity of something exhaustively studied. It was the same basic architecture of digital communication that human engineers had developed in the second half of the 20th century. Pulse width modulation. Binary. The oldest alphabet technological civilization knew. Someone or something was transmitting in binary on the delta pulse frequency, and had been doing so since the moment Vanguard Station had entered the Alcubierre portal. Marcus Vance had taken hours to realize because he had been listening to the music when he should have been reading the score. He had a transmitter, the tablet's communicator reconfigured by 12 lines of spectrum adjustment code. He had the code. He just needed a message that would cross the boundary between what he was and what was on the other side of that amorphous form at the medical bay access. Marcus Vance typed 3 characters onto the tablet and then transmitted on the pulse frequency with the correct modulation. A prime number. 3. The entity stopped. It didn't retreat. It didn't advance. It simply paused. With the precision of a system receiving an input that was outside the environment's expected parameters and needed to reclassify the situation before proceeding. The delta pulse, which had been growing in intensity for the past 30 minutes, stabilized at its current level and remained there, constant as a held breath. Marcus Vance transmitted the next prime number, 5, then 7, 11, 13. The correction entity remained motionless for exactly 42 seconds. Then the delta pulse changed its pattern for the first time since Marcus Vance had begun logging it. The pauses between beats reorganized into a new sequence, and when Marcus Vance ran the real-time analysis, the result appeared on the tablet display with the clarity of something that shouldn't exist, but did. 17. The next prime number in the sequence. Transmitted back. Keth Al, on the observation platform, had entered a state any human present would have described as complete shock, had they known Keth Al was structurally capable of such a thing. Delegate Voss Arundel pulsed a query, and Keth Al took 18 seconds to respond, the equivalent, for a near-instantaneous processing being, of completely losing its train of thought. "The human is conversing with the correction entity," Keth Al finally said. "That's impossible," Voss Arundel replied. "The entity isn't conscious. It has no communication protocol." "Apparently it does," Keth Al said, and looked at the data once more to ensure he wasn't misinterpreting something. He wasn't. It was binary. It was a sequence of primes. It was a conversation. Marcus Vance had no illusions about what he was doing. He wasn't dominating the entity, nor negotiating with it in the conventional human sense of the term. He was establishing the existence of shared language, which was a different and infinitely more humble step than dominance or control. It was what the first radio telescopes pointed into deep space had done a century earlier. Not a conversation, but a signal. We are here. We are capable of structuring information. Perhaps you are too. Perhaps that is enough to begin a conversation. But while he kept the entity stabilized with the prime sequence transmitted at regular intervals, his mind worked in parallel in the direction the conversation with the first observer had opened. Two impossible options on the table: collapse into the stable version, which meant ceasing to exist as this specific version of Marcus Vance, or maintain the divergence in an active state, which the Council's data indicated would destroy the ship and everyone aboard in less than 6 hours. But there was something in Torres's propulsion data that kept returning to the forefront of his analysis. The Alcubierre field, during transit through the portal, had generated not one, but two trajectory records. Two superimposed fields that didn't cancel each other out, but also hadn't managed to sum constructively because there was no alignment protocol between them. They were like two radio waves transmitting on the same frequency without phase synchronization, generating destructive interference instead of an amplified signal. The solution wasn't to erase one of the waves. It was to synchronize the phases. The Alcubierre field as a medium of resonance between quantum layers, not to warp space in any direction, but to create a surface of constructive interference that would allow the progressive alignment of the causal information from both trajectories. Instead of forcing the collapse of one version or the other, treat the two layers as signals that could be summed instead of canceled, producing not the elimination of one of them but the synthesis of both into a single consistent flow. It was, from the perspective of orthodox physics, completely outside the parameters of any documented application of the Alcubierre field. Marcus Vance had sent things outside the parameters to the universe before. The universe, in his experience, usually responded with data. He needed the engine room, and he needed Torres, the version of Torres who was there, with her 16 jumps that had never happened in official history, and her eyes tuned to a channel that perhaps, now that Marcus Vance thought about it, knew the warp field in ways the original mission version had never needed to explore. Marcus Vance configured the tablet's transmitter to continue the prime sequence automatically. 17, 19, 23, 29. He placed the tablet leaning against the medical bay wall with the transmitter oriented towards the entity. Then he walked towards the door, passed directly beside the correction entity at a distance of no more than 1.5 meters, feeling its field as heat that had no temperature and weight that had no mass, and continued into the corridor without hesitation. Behind him, the entity did not move. Delegate Voss Arundel observed this and pulsed to Keth Al. The entity did not follow. Keth Al watched the data in real time. It did not follow, he confirmed. Why? Cathal processed the possibilities for 2 seconds. Because the correction entity is responding to a communication protocol established by the human, and interrupting that protocol to pursue the emitter would be, from the perspective of quantum mechanics, inconsistent with the state of mutual observation that has just been created. The human, essentially. Cathal paused, searching for the correct term among the 46 languages he mastered. Anchored the entity to a state of dialogue. Voss Arundel remained silent for a long moment. With prime numbers and a field analysis tablet. With prime numbers and a field analysis tablet, Cathal confirmed. And then, because 4 centuries of galactic diplomacy had taught him that some situations deserved complete honesty instead of careful diplomatic phrasing, he added, I am reclassifying this situation, not to an anomaly degree, to a different category, one for which we do not yet have adequate technical language. In the engine room, Torres was at the main console when Marcus Vance entered, and her fingers were already moving on the warp field controls, with a familiarity Marcus Vance observed and cataloged as evidence of someone who had calibrated that system under conditions the original mission version had never faced. People working under extreme pressure developed motor sequences that didn't exist under normal conditions. Torres had them. The Alcubierre field as a transmission medium, Torres said, before Marcus Vance opened his mouth. She looked up from the console. You arrived at the same conclusion I did. Marcus Vance stood still for a moment. When did you reach that conclusion? 3 hours ago. Torres made a gesture that was half frustration, half relief from someone who could finally share a burden. But I needed someone who understood quantum theory enough to confirm the math works before attempting the configuration. Do you confirm? The math works in theory, Marcus Vance said. The execution requires a field configuration that has never been tested under any documented conditions. Torres smiled, and for the first time since exiting the portal, the smile was completely, unmistakably hers, of the woman Marcus Vance had seen solve impossible problems with the serenity of someone who had decided, at some point in her career, that impossible was merely a temporary category. Good, she said. New work is my favorite. How much time do we have? Marcus Vance looked at the tablet's clock. The prime sequence was transmitting. The entity was anchored. Enough time, he said, for us to try. And then they began to work. Torres didn't ask how Marcus Vance had reached the engine room with the correction entity technically anchored in communication in the medical bay. She was already at the main console, her fingers moving on the warp field controls with a familiarity Marcus Vance read as fluency. The difference between someone who learned a language and someone who was born into it. They worked for 47 minutes. Marcus Vance on theory, adjusting the mathematical parameters in real time as Torres tested them on the ship's systems and reported the deviations. The central idea was to use the Alcubierre field not to warp space in any direction, but to create a surface of constructive interference between the 2 quantum layers the ship simultaneously inhabited. Instead of forcing the collapse of one version or the other, the field would act as a medium of resonance between them, allowing the causal information from both trajectories to progressively align. It was like tuning 2 sufficiently close radio frequencies until the waves added up instead of canceling out, producing neither silence nor noise but a signal stronger than either one alone. No Alcubierre field operation manual documented this configuration. Torres built it from scratch, using the specifications Marcus Vance derived from the spectral analysis of the delta pulse, treating each beat as field data rather than environmental vibration. It was, technically speaking, an improvised solution on a system whose construction cost was equivalent to the gross domestic product of a medium-sized country. Space engineering rarely approved improvised solutions. The universe, Marcus Vance had learned, approved results. Commander Chen appeared at the engineering door 30 minutes after work began. The correction entity has moved, she informed, with the voice of someone who had decided that a factual tone was the only one available for that kind of information. "It's in Corridor D, slowly advancing towards this section. Vance's tablet is still transmitting, but the sequence is slowing down. It will be here in approximately 12 minutes. "We need 8, Torres said without looking up. "We have 6, Marcus Vance said. Torres adjusted 3 parameters at the same time. Kethal had completely stopped transmitting emergency alerts to Vanguard Station, which was in itself an unprecedented deviation from Council protocol in situations of active laminar anomaly. In its place, the delegate had opened a high-resolution documentation channel and was recording everything, each sensor reading, each internal communication, each field variation detectable from the observation platform. In 43 recorded cases over 10,000 years, none had reached this point. Affected species had collapsed, evacuated, or cognitively disintegrated before any attempt at active resolution was completed. The humans were attempting to resolve a Degree 7 anomaly using a warp field engine hand-recalibrated by 2 engineers in less than 50 minutes. Delegate Voss Arundel asked, "Do you think it will work?" "I don't know," Kethal said, with an honesty few delegates would display in a situation of professional uncertainty. And then, because there was something in the ship's emission data that made the uncertainty less disturbing than it should have been, he added, "But I'm starting to think 'I don't know' is the most correct answer whenever the human variable is present." The Alcubierre field was reconfigured at 2244. Not for a jump, for resonance. The effect was immediate and completely different from what Marcus Vance had mathematically projected, which was, in his experience, exactly how the best discoveries always behaved. The delta pulse didn't stop. It didn't change frequency. But its nature changed with a clarity that was physical before it was cognitive. Instead of coming from below, from the ship's structure, it began to come from everywhere at once, as if the entire Vanguard Station had become the instrument instead of just the stage on which the instrument was playing. And then, for an interval, Marcus Vance would later estimate at approximately 8 seconds, but which subjectively felt like something that couldn't be contained in seconds. He felt both versions of the mission simultaneously with the clarity of someone hearing 2 tones merge into a chord. He felt the portal closing at 4 minutes and 11 seconds, the engines retracting, Commander Chen giving the abort order with the precision she used for all difficult decisions, the portal opening in reverse, the arrival, the silence, Earth with its clouds and its oceans and its yellow sun exactly where it should be. And at the same time, he felt the full 7 minutes. He felt the arrival at Sigma Draconis, the asteroid belt that wasn't there, the delta pulse from the very first beat, Torres with eyes tuned to another channel, Kethal on the observation platform, the entity in the corridor, the conversation with himself reflected in a sterilization chamber, the prime numbers transmitted in the darkness of a medical bay. The 2 currents of memory did not cancel each other out. They summed. Then reality reorganized. Marcus Vance awoke in his apartment bed in Greenwich, with the morning sun streaming through the window and the muffled sound of air traffic outside. The alarm clock read 007:15. The date was 3 days after the launch of Vanguard Station. He remained motionless for 23 seconds, taking inventory of the situation with the methodology of someone whose training had taught him that data first and conclusions later was the only sequence that didn't lead to error. Then he got up, went to the computer, and confirmed what he already suspected. Official records indicated that the mission had been aborted at 4 minutes and 11 seconds of transit through the Alcubierre portal due to field instability in the propulsion sector. The crew had returned safely. Marcus Vance had spent the last 3 days in routine post-mission medical observation. There was nothing in the records about the vanished asteroid belt, the different-eyed Torres, the 43 cases from the Council database, nor about prime numbers transmitted to an amorphous entity in a quantum superimposed ship corridor. But there was a tablet on his apartment table, battery drained, log history preserved in solid-state memory that didn't need power to retain data. 48 hours of logs. The delta pulse, cataloged from the first beat. The manifestations documented with time, location, and duration. The full spectral analysis of the quantum field. The prime sequence and the entity's response. The Alcubierre field configuration as a resonator, mathematically derived and tested under real conditions. And at the end of the log, an entry he had made at 22:43, 1 minute before the field's reconfiguration, which merely stated, "If this works, someone will need to know it worked. Not for official records. For what comes next." Marcus Vance stared at the tablet for a long moment. Then he turned on the coffee maker, sat down at the table, and began to write. 3 weeks later, Delegate Keith All sent a formal communication to the Unified Space Alliance. It was not an emergency alert. It was not a containment or quarantine protocol. It was a request for a joint scientific meeting to discuss the data from the Sigma Draconis laminar quantum anomaly, and specifically, the resolution methodology applied by the crew of Vanguard Station. The Galactic Council, which had documented 43 cases of laminar anomaly without ever witnessing a successful active resolution attempt, wanted to understand how a young species, without adequate quantum detection technology, without established protocols for that class of event, and with instruments the Council would classify as primitive for the scale of the problem, had achieved what 10,000 years of galactic history had never produced. Marcus Vance's response to Keith All's communique took 2 days to draft, not because it was long, but because it needed to be precise on the only point that mattered. In the end, after 4 discarded drafts, he wrote, "The methodology is completely documentable and can be taught to any team with access to an Alcubierre field and precision spectral analysis. What is not documentable is what motivated it. The refusal to accept that the only available options were necessarily the only existing options. The willingness to attempt a communication that all data indicated was impossible, because impossible meant untried, and untried meant there was still room for a first time. This, as far as I can determine, is simply how humans function when we are low on resources and high on problems." Cathal read the response, then reread it, then sent it to all 4,300 members of the Galactic Council with a forwarding note that read, "Review of official human species classification, requested based on field evidence. Current classification, young, moderate capabilities, developing. Proposed classification." And then Keth Al stared at the screen for a long moment before completing, with the precision of someone who had spent 4 centuries carefully choosing words and knew the weight each carried, unpredictable. Maintain respectful distance. Monitor with continuous and considerable attention. Marcus Vance felt the delta pulse for the last time that night at 02:17 as he closed the final version of the technical report. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the echo of something that had occurred in a place maps had not yet reached. He logged it, named the file, and went to sleep with the specific calm of someone who had done what was possible to do and documented enough for others to do the rest. In his dream, there was a ship in an alien system, and the asteroid belt wasn't where it should be. And on the floor beneath his feet, there was a vibration that was the language the universe used when it was still trying to understand what it had created and what it meant for everything that was to come. And Marcus Vance, even in his dream, was not afraid. He had data, he had a tablet, and he had the calm conviction that the universe, on whatever layer was still listening, had become at least a little more interesting because of the last 7 minutes that never fully ended, and that, if there was any justice in physics, never should. End of story. If the tenacity of the human crew has inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier. Every mission begins with a leap in the dark, and humans are the only ones crazy enough to jump with their eyes open. a tablet in hand, and a cup of coffee that kills 6 alien species, but for them is just the fourth of the shift.